Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Nicholas Carr to Harvard Bookstore to discuss his new book, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. Mr. Carr is the author of The Big Switch and Does It Matter, and his writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Wired, The Financial Times, and the New York Times Magazine, among other publications. He's the former executive editor of the Harvard Business Review, and he's on the steering board of the World Economic Forum's Cloud Computing Project. In The Shallows, Mr. Carr considers how the internet and modern media are restructuring our brains. Mr. Carr examines the evolution of information technology from the development of written language through the invention of the printing press, radio, television, and up to email, Google, Facebook, and other hallmarks of our new wired and wireless lifestyle. Citing recent psychological and neurological research, Mr. Carr argues that while the benefits of new information technologies are evident, they come at the cost of contemplation and focus and are changing the very way we think. Slate called The Shadows a silent spring for the literary mind, and the Wall Street Journal called the book absorbing and disturbing.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, and thanks all of you for coming out. I'll try not to be too disturbing, given how warm it is today. What I'd like to do is spend a few minutes talking about the general themes of the book, and then read a very short passage to give you a feel for the writing and the style, and then open it up, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or hear any comments you might have. The Shallows comes out of my own personal experience. I've been a big user of computers, and since back when I bought my first PC, a Mac Plus in 1986, became a writer about technology, was and continues to be a big user of the net and a great aficionado of that. But a couple of years ago, I began to realize that I was having a lot of trouble concentrating. And I noticed it particularly when I'd sit down to read a book, something that throughout my life has come completely naturally to me. And I realized that after a couple of paragraphs, or at most a couple of pages, I had this overwhelming urge to get up and check my email, start clicking on links, do some Googling, do all the kinds of things that we're all getting used to doing when we're online. And at first, I thought, okay, this is just middle-aged mind rot setting in. And I'm sure there's some of that. But it was so clear that my mind wanted to behave in exactly the way it behaved when I was sitting at a computer or looking at my cell phone, that I began to see the correspondence between my ever-increasing use of the web, use of digital media, and my inability to concentrate, inability not only to read a book, but to kind of focus on one thing for more than a few minutes. And so I began to look into both the history of technology, particularly the technologies we use to think with, and also the neuroscience, into how the brain works and what I could learn about my own, what seemed to be a condition, from the science. And so The Shallows, the basic overarching subject of The Shallows is how those tools that we use to think with, what I call our intellectual technologies, influence the way that we think. And I think you can trace this influence back throughout humankind's intellectual history. I go all the way back to the map, which is something that we all take for granted today. But of course, at some point, long ago, there were no maps, and somebody had to invent it. It's a technology. And up until the point when the map was invented, the only way to perceive location, to perceive where we are, and to get around in the world, was through direct sensory perception. You saw the trees, you saw the mountains, you heard things, and that's how you got around. With the map, all of a sudden, we could replace our direct sensory apprehension of the world with an abstract representation of that world. And of course, that allowed us to do a whole lot more things, practical things. We could go places we'd never been before with confidence because somebody had charted them out. But it also, I think more basically and more broadly, gave us a more abstract way of thinking in general. So completely outside of what the original people who created maps and the original people who used them thought about. Nevertheless, there were some of these deep cognitive and intellectual consequences of map use. And I think the same thing or a similar thing happened with the mechanical clock. Once again, until the clock came around, time was a natural flow, a cyclical flow. And suddenly the mechanical clock broke time up into these little pieces, these little perfectly measurable pieces, seconds, minutes, hours, and so forth. And again, the basic tool was used for all sorts of practical purposes, to make sure we were on time, to coordinate the work of a lot of people in factories, and so forth. But the deeper consequence was that it gave us this technology, this intellectual technology, gave us a more scientific mind, one that focused on measuring things very carefully, on seeing the world as this almost clock-like gearing system that had cause and effect. And so those two examples, in some ways very simple technologies, I think get across the profound effect that the tools we use to gather information, store information, exchange information can have on the way we think, and even can reshape the course of intellectual history. Most of the book, though, is focused on two much more recent intellectual technologies. On the one hand, the book, which again we think of as so commonplace and we're surrounded by them, but really is a fairly recent invention in history, only a few thousand years old, and much more recent than that in its modern form. And as opposed to the book, the latest in the great intellectual technologies we use to make sense of the world, the internet. I think, and I argue, that these two technologies, even though in some ways we use them for similar purposes, to gather information, to store information, have very, very different effects on the way we think. If you think about the book, for instance, the modern book really, we tend to think of the great technological advance in the book as being Gutenberg, who invented the printing press, of course, about 550 years ago. But before that, about 1,000 years ago, came a technological development in the history of the book that was every bit as momentous as Gutenberg's, but we don't hear about it anymore, and that was the introduction of the word space. It seems incredible to believe it, but up until 1,000 years ago, when people wrote, they didn't put spaces between the words that they wrote. And this was because writing came out of the oral tradition, and at first simply represented oral speech. And if you look at a child, when a child learns to write, children don't put spaces between words because they simply write what they hear. And when we talk, we don't put little precise spaces between words. As you can hear, the syllables kind of just flow out. What happened as soon as there was the introduction of the word space 1,000 years ago, is that reading changed fundamentally. Up until then, figuring out what you were reading was really hard. And in order to do it, in order to figure out where one word ended and another began, you had to read out loud. So almost all the reading that was done until then was done out loud. It was very much a social type of exchange of information. As soon as you put word spaces in, it became much easier to read, and as a result, people began to read silently. And reading became a very personal and often a very solitary pursuit. And it also became the actual decoding of text, figuring out what each word meant, became very automatic. And what that did is freed our minds up to go very deep into the text. And suddenly you got this personal form of reading that was highly interpretive, not just figuring out what the author was saying, but kind of connecting with the author in a very deep way, a very emotional way often, in many cases. Gutenberg's press then didn't so much invent the modern book as push it out to a broader population. It democratized the book by making it much cheaper, much easier to manufacture, and as it did that, it also pushed this new way of thinking out to the masses. And this way of thinking was, on the one hand, solitary, on the one hand, very concentrated, and it was all built around paying deep attention to one thing. And this was something that was very rare in the course of human history. Our basic wiring, our basic instinct is to keep shifting our attention among lots of things simultaneously, to multitask, to make sure that we don't miss anything going on in the environment. And you can understand why that's true. Back when we were cavemen and cave women, if you paid attention to one thing too long, you probably got eaten by a predator very, very quickly, or clubbed on the head, or whatever happened back then. So paying attention to one thing, being deeply engaged in one thing, is a very unnatural act. And it was the book that helped bring that style of thinking to a broad portion of the population. And you can trace the effects of what that meant over the course of the last 500 years. You see an explosion in literary experimentation, for instance. The arrival of the novel, much more complexity of argument, complexity of narrative, a great deal of experimentation, for instance. And all of this emerged when writers began to assume that a very attentive reader was out there. As soon as you knew that the reader was going to pay attention to what you wrote for a long time, you could do those kind of experiments. Suddenly, what was written down was no longer just a utilitarian tool to pass information around. It became truly a literary, artistic experience. And it went beyond literature to the areas of science, all the things that could be written about. Suddenly we had deep involvement, deep engagement, deep focus on what we were reading, and that, again, transferred out into our general lives. People, after that, became able to concentrate their attention in a way that had been limited to only a very small portion of society. The internet, I would argue, is almost precisely the opposite, almost precisely the opposite effect as an intellectual technology. If the great thing about the book is that it shielded you from distraction, the only thing going on by a book is the words. And when you concentrate on it, you filter out all the stimuli going on around you. The internet, in contrast, inundates us with stimulation, inundates us with distractions. And this, I think, is fundamentally its nature. And in fact, all the good things that we enjoy from the net are woven up in this way of distributing information. The net is fundamentally a hypermedia or hypertext system. It has all those links that let us navigate very quickly between related bits of information. It's a multimedia system, so it's not restricted to just video or audio or images or text. It can bring all of those together and transmit them simultaneously. It's also a messaging system, very powerful messaging system that can exchange information between people or between groups of people instantaneously almost. And as a messaging system, that means it's also an interruption system. It's very good at interrupting us. And as we all know, if we spend any time online or with our cell phones or our iPhones, our Blackberries, more and more we're in a constant stream of interruptions and distractions. And finally, the fourth kind of major characteristic of the net is that it's a system that promotes multitasking. So you're not just doing one thing when you're looking into your screen, whether it's a smartphone screen or a computer screen. You're usually juggling lots of different things, whether it's checking email, reading something, watching a YouTube video, gathering tweets, whatever you happen to be doing. It allows you to do all of that, again, simultaneously. And this is why we spend so much time online. We like these characteristics of the net. We like to be interrupted, actually, because as psychologists have found, human beings crave new information. And I think this relates back to the way having our focus scattered being very natural part of our survival once. It's been shown that, if you're given access to new information, you'll go and you'll grab it, regardless of whether it's trivial or important. And in fact, if you have an important piece of information, in whatever form, that you really should be paying attention to, if you know that there's new information coming through, you'll look to the new information. There was an amazing study of office workers with computers that showed that they'll glance at their inbox, their email inbox, 30 or 40 times an hour. And this was before, the BlackBerry and the iPhone and mobile email. But when you think about that, each one of those glances is a little break in attention. It's a little distraction. And the problem with all of these distractions, all of this influx of information, is that it, on the one hand, it provides us with all these new, diverting, and often very valuable tools for finding information and gathering it and exchanging it, but it bypasses or overrides the mental processes that are really key to the formation of deep thoughts, of deep, broad conceptual thoughts. And that is the ability to move information that's coming at us from our short-term memory or working memory, where it comes and goes in milliseconds or seconds, into our long-term memory. And it's only when information gets into our long-term memory that we create the rich set of connections with other information that we've remembered or experiences we've had that gives our thinking richness and distinctiveness. And if we're constantly distracted, if we're constantly glancing at different things, juggling tasks, we never pay enough attention to get information from that short-term store into our long-term memory. Attention is the key to the entire process of transferring information into long-term memory and creating connections. And we all kind of know what happens when our short-term memory is overloaded. For instance, if you've ever got up in your house and said, gee, I need to do something in the next room, and you take 3 steps over, and all of a sudden you've forgotten what you got up to do. And the reason is because in the meantime, during those 3 steps, you've seen things around you, you've looked at things around you, maybe you thought about a conversation you had earlier in the day or some appointment you have tomorrow. In your short-term memory, which can only hold a very little bit of information, has been overloaded, and you've forgotten what it is that you wanted to pay attention to, whatever you set out to do. And that just shows when that kind of becomes our main way of taking in information, which I think is what's happening today with the net, we're in that perpetual state of distractedness. We're losing, things are coming into and out of our memory without sticking into our long-term memory, where really the richness of thought begins. And you can see evidence of this in many studies that have been done over the last 20 or more years of the different aspects of the net. There have been studies, for instance, of hyperlinks, the little links that seem pretty innocuous when we're online and extremely valuable if you want to hop between information. But what's been found is that even if you don't click on a link, it overloads your short-term memory because your brain has to click in and say, do I want to click on this or not? So there's a little mental process going on. And there was one very interesting study where a woman gave the same piece of text to a bunch of different people to read on a computer screen. And all she did was vary the number of links appearing in the text. And what she found is, as the number of links increased, reading comprehension, she gave a test afterwards, reading comprehension went down. And it didn't matter if you clicked on the links or not. Just the appearance of the links was a distraction. And in very similar ways, we see that multimedia presentations of information also tend to decrease comprehension and understanding and learning compared to if you just focused on information coming in one, whether it's text or video or audio in one way. And interruptions also, similar type of research showing that the more you're interrupted, the more you lose track of information, the less able you are to have a rich, deep understanding. And finally, multitasking, also very similar effects. Now, on the other hand, it's not all negative by any means. There are also studies that show that there are cognitive benefits to internet use. You tend to increase, say, a lot of visual acuity when you use the net a lot. And this comes through particularly in studies of video gaming, and there have been a lot of them. Video gamers, as you might expect, are much better at shifting their focus among many different things on a screen, many different stimuli, and picking out which are important to the immediate, whatever immediate task they want to do, killing a zombie or whatever it is. And similarly, it helps hand-eye coordination. And it can even, there's some indications, it can even help expand the capacity of short-term memory, of working memory, if we're juggling things all the time, which is very important because that means we gain a better ability to pay attention. But when we think about those benefits, we have to look at the downside of this. And there are further studies that show that even as we improve our ability to multitask, our ability to shift our attention among many different things, we're hindering our ability to do what psychologists call deep processing, the kind of rich critical thinking, intuition, reflection, introspection, contemplation. All of these things get thrown to the side as we become more adept at processing all of these interruptions coming at us all at once. And the most troubling part of all this comes when we look at some recent discoveries about the plasticity of the brain, as neuroscientists say, or the adaptability of the brain. Until very recently, it was assumed, or it was thought, that the brain, the human brain, was fixed, basically, in its structure by the time we reached our 20s. When we were children, when we were very young, that's when all our neural pathways were laid. And then after that, you basically were stuck with whatever you developed when you were a baby and a child and a teenager. We now know that that's wrong. That's completely wrong, that in fact our brains are always adapting to our environment and to whatever stimuli we're processing. And they're adapting at a very deep cellular level. So when we practice one mode of thinking, we strengthen the connections between our brain cells, our neurons that support that way of thinking. But when we fail to practice a different way of thinking, then we begin to lose the capability to perform that. And I think that explains why many of us, even when we're not online today, even when we're not sitting in front of a computer, feel distracted, feel like it's harder and harder to concentrate, like it's harder and harder to sit down and engage in contemplative thought or deep reading or solitary thought. It's because we're literally, as we practice these very distracted modes of thinking, we're literally rewiring our brains to be very good at them and to want to do them. But at the same time, as we neglect the more attentive modes of thought, and I think the deeper modes of thought, and the more interesting modes of thought, we're losing our ability to do that, to perform those things. That brings me to a brief reading I'd like to do from a passage of the book. This comes toward the end of it, when I anticipate a question that readers will probably have by then, and perhaps having gone through the general themes of the book, it's a question that you have as well. I know what you're thinking. The very existence of this book would seem to contradict its thesis. If I'm finding it so hard to concentrate, to stay focused on a line of thought, how in the world did I manage to write a few hundred pages of at least semi-coherent prose? It wasn't easy. When I began writing The Shallows toward the end of 2007, I struggled in vain to keep my mind fixed on the task. The net provided, as always, a bounty of useful information and research tools, but its constant interruptions scattered my thoughts and words. I tended to write in disconnected spurts, the same way I wrote when blogging. It was clear that big changes were in order. In the summer of the following year, I moved with my wife from a highly connected suburb of Boston to the mountains of Colorado. There was no cell phone service at our new home, and the internet arrived through a relatively pokey DSL connection. I canceled my Twitter account, put my Facebook membership on hiatus, and mothballed my blog. I shut down my RSS reader and curtailed my Skyping and instant messaging. Most important, I throttled back my email application. It had long been set to check for new messages every minute. I reset it to check only once an hour, and when that still created too much of a distraction, I began keeping the program closed for much of the day. The dismantling of my online life was far from painless. For months, my synapses howled for their net fix. I found myself sneaking clicks on the check for new mail button. Occasionally, I'd go on a day-long web binge. But in time, the cravings subsided, and I found myself able to type at my keyboard for hours on end, or to read through a dense academic paper without my mind wandering. Some old, disused neural circuits were springing back to life, it seemed, and some of the newer web-wired ones were quieting down. I started to feel generally calmer and more in control of my thoughts. less like a lab rat pressing a lever, and more like, well, a human being. My brain could breathe again. My case, I realize, isn't typical. Being self-employed and of a fairly solitary nature, I have the option of disconnecting. Most people today don't. The web is so essential to their work and social lives that even if they wanted to escape the network, they could not. In a recent essay, the young novelist Benjamin Kunkel mulled over the net's expanding hold on his waking hours. Quote, "The internet, as its proponents rightly remind us, makes for variety and convenience. It does not force anything on you. Only it turns out it doesn't feel like that at all. We don't feel as if we had freely chosen our online practices. We feel instead that they are habits we have helplessly picked up or that history has enforced, that we are not distributing our attention as we intend or even like to." End of quote. The question really isn't whether people can still read or write the occasional book. Of course they can. When we begin using a new intellectual technology, we don't immediately switch from one mental mode to another. The brain isn't binary. An intellectual technology exerts its influence by shifting the emphasis of our thought. Although even the initial users of the technology can often sense the changes in their patterns of attention, cognition, and memory as their brains adapt to the new medium, the most profound shifts play out more slowly over several generations as the technology becomes ever more embedded in work, leisure, and education, in all the norms and practices that define a society in its culture. How is the way we read changing? How is the way we write changing? How is the way we think changing? Those are the questions we should be asking, both of ourselves and of our children. As for me, I'm already backsliding. With the end of this book in sight, I've gone back to keeping my email running all the time, and I've jacked into my RSS feed again. I've been playing around with a few new social networking services, and have been posting some new entries to my blog. I recently broke down and bought a Blu-ray player with a built-in Wi-Fi connection. It lets me stream music from Pandora, movies from Netflix, and videos from YouTube through my television in stereo. I have to confess, it's cool. I'm not sure I could live without it. One of the points there is that as we become more dependent on a new intellectual technology, it does get woven into the expectations, social expectations we all feel. And so backing away becomes not just a matter of personal choice. Often if you disconnect, if you back away from the technology, you may suffer career consequences if your boss and all your colleagues expect you to be always reachable, always connected, and you might feel socially isolated if all your friends are moment by moment putting their plans together through Facebook or through Twitter or through text messaging. On the other hand, all of us as individuals do in the end have choices and are in control of our minds. And I think if we do value the calmer, more attentive, more introspective, more contemplative, and often more solitary modes of thought, we have no choice but to begin to back away from our connected existence, not give it up, but begin to back away and practice those other ways of thinking, those more attentive ways of thinking, whether it's reading long books, whether it's reading long articles, whether it's staring out your window for a long time, thinking about whatever is out there to see, whether it's engaging in some hobby that requires a huge amount of attentiveness. If we don't keep this balance in the lives of our mind, I think we're going to see those lives become less interesting, flatter, and less distinctive. And that not only affects each of us as individuals in the intellectual lives we lead, but I think if you look at culture as a whole, and particularly the great monuments of culture that have been built up over the years, you see that they were done by people who were able to pay attention, whether it's in art, whether it's in science, whether it's in literature. All of culture, I think, is founded on the ability to engage, not just in scanning and skimming and in rapid communication, but in quiet, solitary modes of thought. And if we want to perpetuate those, we have to make an effort to practice them. So let me end there, and I'm happy to take any questions that anybody might have. I'm not a doctor, so I'm wary of commenting on that. I think there's a fair chance that technology has a role in that, and there's one school of thought that thinks that the disorder might be related to constraints on working memory, on short-term memory, the overloading of working memory. And if that's true, then being constantly bombarded by information from media would certainly seem to play a role. But I think, I think the jury's probably still out on what's causing what appears to be an increase in ADHD. So the question is, the brain adapted to earlier intellectual technologies. It adapted to the book. Why won't it adapt to the internet? It will adapt, and I think that's the problem. The brain is very adaptable, but adaptation is a process of change. So what we have to ask ourselves is not will we adapt. I think we'll adapt to whatever we're handed. The question is, what is the adaptation doing to us? What are we changing from and into? Because the process of adaptation and being able to make sense of all this flood of information means that skill will get better, probably, but it also means we may well lose other mental skills, the ones I've been talking about. So adaptation in itself always happens, but the end of adaptation, what we become, may not always be better than what we started out as. In order for it to be positive, then we have to do what I said, which is make sure that we leave room to practice a variety of ways of thinking. And the problem with the net, particularly in its recent history, for instance, the rise of social networking, the rise of the mobile net, smartphones and stuff, keeps pushing the velocity of information faster and faster, in the bits of information smaller and smaller. We've gone in just a few years from the defining metaphor of online information being the page. We go and look at pages of information, to now it's becoming what Facebook and Google and stuff call the stream of information. It's this constant, very fast bombardment of lots of short messages. So in order to maintain both styles of thought, we have to go against what seems to be the natural grain of the net as a technology, which actually doesn't want to give us any opportunity or any encouragement to slow down and think deeply about one thing. And the question is, maybe what we're seeing in this shift away from some modes of solitary attentive thinking to much more fast sharing of information, fast messaging and collaboration, is just a change in the way society will define creativity and define products. And my sense is that may well be what's going on, that I think there's a long-term trend in society, and it predates the web, to place ever more value on things like problem solving, efficiency, creation of products, in ever less devaluing the more solitary, attentive ways of thinking. The ways of thinking that are less about solving problems than simply exercising our thought, kind of the open-ended ways of thinking. So you may be right that all of society is going to redefine the norms and expectations of our lives to say that this is the way we should behave and this is what we're going to get rewarded for. But still, that means that still doesn't change the fact that we lose what has been up until now, not only a marker of the richness of our individual lives, but an underpinning of culture. And if we make that decision to give up that, we should at least be clear with ourselves that that's what we're doing. That's a very good question. Whether I've talked about, dealing with this at an individual level by changing individual habits. The question is, aren't there broader efforts, changing institutions, changing government, changing social norms even? I'm not sure, I guess. My own feeling is where we are in this right now is that for most people it's not seen as a problem, and therefore there's no reason to solve it. And so in order for people to change, I think the first step is simply to become aware that maybe we're losing something important, even as we're gaining all the benefits of the web. And to me, that has to begin at the individual level, though you may be right that groups of individuals can plumb those questions even better than just single individuals. But nevertheless, I think before institutions begin to change, before employers begin to say, no, we don't want you to be connected all the time, people at the individual level have to become aware of the problem and have to say, we don't want this all the time. We want to exercise different modes of thought. So I think eventually that changing institutions and changing norms becomes possible, but not until enough people actually consider it a problem. I think the flow of information and the expectation to be part of that flow will grow steadily, in that we will, as a society, decide that, oh, literary thinking, contemplative thinking, staring out the window, solitary thinking, they weren't all that important anyway, so it's good that we've gotten rid of them, and now we're much more productive, efficient cogs in the system. On the other hand, my guess is that there will be and I think it'll be basically a countercultural movement that will arise among some subset of the population that will say, no, this isn't the way we want to live. There are other things beside productivity and efficiency and constant communication that are important. How big that countercultural movement will be, I don't know. It could be very small. It could be big enough to actually make some changes. The question is morality and how lack of contemplative thought may affect that. I get a little worried about talking about this because I'm already, called a Luddite and a curmudgeon. If I start talking about the internet eroding our morals, that'll be it for me. But I do think, having said that, and I think I would be wary of making any kind of big claims about the moral implications of this change, because that's one area where people I think are generally pretty good at adapting. But there are some studies of what might be called the deeper emotions, or the more refined emotions, very sophisticated forms of empathy, for instance. And what they seem to point to is that these emotions, our finer emotions, actually take time to emerge in our minds. They're actually slow intellectual processes, as opposed to, say, the more primitive forms of empathy. If you see somebody get physically hurt, it's instantaneous, it's a very primitive type of mental process. So if that's true, if in fact our deepest, most human emotions come out of fairly slow intellectual processes, then if we're constantly distracted and constantly interrupted, you could, make the case that this will prevent us from having those emotions, or at least dampen them in the future. I think the research here is too early to make any conclusion, but it's certainly a concern when you look at that. So the question is, will we just naturally, our ability to filter out the trivia and unimportant things grow as we become more used to the medium? I don't know. My guess is that probably it won't. And the reason is, again, there was a very interesting study that was done at Stanford last year by a lab run by a guy named Clifford Nass. And he took a bunch of heavy media multitaskers and another set of people who much more rarely involve themselves in media multitasking, and he gave them he and his team gave them a whole range of cognitive tests. And the heavy multitaskers did worse on every single one of those tests. They even did worse on the tests that gauged multitasking skill. They found it harder they were less efficient shifting their attention between different tasks. But the weird thing and the concerning thing is, when you ask these people if they're good at multitasking, they'll say, oh yeah, I'm great at multitasking. I do it all the time. I'm really good at it. And so we may get a sense that we're really good at it as we do it more and more, but in fact that might be an illusion and we might actually get even worse and worse and worse at filtering the trivia from the important stuff. And I think there's some truth to that. I'm not arguing that everybody was, sitting around reading Paradise Lost. That never happened. But to me, that makes this form of thought all not more dispensable, but all the more precious. The fact that not all that many people might engage in literary thinking or attentive thinking or whatever. That means that we have to make sure that those people who have that ability are given the opportunity to develop those skills. And since we don't know who those people are from the moment they're born, we need to encourage everyone to try to develop these more attentive skills. So the fact that it's rare doesn't make me worry less. It seems to me that makes it all the more precious and all the more reason for worrying about giving people less opportunities to develop it. And it's not just about narratives. I mean, the demand for any type of contemplative, concentrated thought, I think, is shrinking. And then as demand shrinks, the production of it shrinks as well, particularly if we're talking about creative works. Well, on your first point, I think you're absolutely right that solitary, deep, attentive thinking is not the only way to be creative or innovative. There's also collaboration, and there is a kind of juggling information and bouncing ideas off lots of people can be energizing and can lead to its own kinds of progress in great thinking. So I don't deny that. My focus is that we want to spur that and we want to reap the rewards of that, but we don't want to give up the other side. As for the other thing, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, and this is kind of what I was getting at when I said we're moving from the page as being the metaphor to the stream, that I think really just in the last few years, and thanks to things like Facebook, Twitter, the expectation is that you're going to exchange ever shorter bits of information. I mean, as a blogger now, I feel completely out of date. It's like, I'm going to write 3 paragraphs when people are zinging 140 characters back and forth all day. And we see it in texting, in some ways, is the most profound change in just the last few years, particularly for kids who now, the average American teenager sends or receives between 2,000 or 3,000 text messages a month, and some are way the hell higher than that. And you have to realize, throughout your waking hours, you're being interrupted in one way or another every minute or two. And how can you develop the discipline to think in different ways when that's going on? So I think that's definitely an ongoing trend. Does the iPad return us in some ways to more concentrated, or give us the opportunity to do that? I think we're kind of, it's hard to say right now. I mean, if you look at the Kindle, for instance, an e-reader, up until now it's been pretty good at presenting a page of text in a fairly calm, quiet way. In the iPad, even though it's a multifunctional device, the reading applications, iBooks and others, also, when you see pages of text on there, it is quieter and calmer than if you just went out on the web. So on the one hand, that's a good development. On the other hand, I think what we know about the progress of gadgets, particularly connected gadgets in general, is that they always go toward more and more features and more multifunctionality and multitasking. And one reason is that there's this huge competition among providers, and to distinguish themselves, they keep putting new features in. So even with the Kindle now, we're seeing, there are links in it. You click on a word, you go to Wikipedia. They just introduced a highlighting function that passages as you read, when you're reading, will be automatically highlighted if a bunch of other readers of the same book highlighted that thing. With the iPad, it's somewhat a crippled device now because it's a unitasking operating system, but Apple is now rolling out a multitasking operating system. So unfortunately, the push of competition, the push of technological advance seems always to be toward more distraction rather than less. And the most worrying sign now is that publishers, who are facing not the greatest future, print publishers, see these devices as ways to begin to bring video clips and audio into books, social networking features, so you can, exchange notes about what you're reading with other people simultaneously, and all those things, each of those things, in and of itself can sound attractive, but they're all ways to break the attentiveness and to turn the kind of solitary deep reading into more of a, team sport or something. So on the one hand, it's encouraging. On the other, I know what happens with these devices over time. So will there be multiple internets out there, and that if we don't want to be distracted all the time, we can go to that internet and otherwise to the other? It's possible, and I think there are already software applications, for instance, something called Freedom and many others, that you can install, and you can you can program them to cut you off from the internet for a certain amount of time, or block your emails, or do all sorts of things. And on the one hand, those seem good. On the other, of course, you have to wonder about them because we've always had the ability to cut ourselves off from the internet or to turn off our email. So,
Not really.
well, right, but just the fact that they exist shows that some people are actually starting to get concerned about what's going on. Whether those will become mainstream or not, and whether enough people will want a kind of quieter, calmer, kinder internet to actually bring one into existence, that's the open question. And if enough people want it, somebody will supply it, certainly. You're right that I'm using the internet in a loose way to encompass all kinds of digital media, digital communication tools, because I think in our lives they are all lumped together, and we might as well look at the whole thing rather than individual things. And the other part of the question is, why not, instead of demonizing the internet, why not focus on developing the cognitive skills that allow us to deal with constant dopamine injections from getting little bits of cool information? I don't know. I mean, I guess because most people actually like to get those dopamine injections and actually crave them, and I'm not sure that they, because there's a real pleasure in getting new information. There's a real pleasure in being in touch with lots of other people who are your friends. So I'm not sure that, again, this plays into my sense that most people don't see this as a problem. They see it as a wonderful new world where they are constantly distracted in a way that they don't necessarily find unpleasant. Probably. I mean, if you look at the habits, and particularly with texting, Facebooking, stuff like that, I mean, it's a very different kind of model of socializing than we've seen before. I haven't looked all that much into the social consequences of this, and I'm sure there are good ones, and I'm sure there will be bad ones, but it's almost certainly going to have deep effects on the way people not only think but socialize. And to your earlier point, my own hope is that schools and educators who have, with some major exceptions, have kind of been big advocates of bringing ever more technology into the classroom at ever younger grades will start to look at some of the studies and start to say, hey, maybe we need to keep computers out of schools, at least for the earlier grades. And of course that requires parents who up until now have equated technology investment in schools with better schools, even though there's very little evidence that those things are connected, to also take a harder look at what inundating young children with technology is doing, and also changing perhaps their habits. And what we've seen in recent years with text messaging, for instance, is that a parent will get a young kid a cell phone for altogether good reasons. They want to, for safety reasons, the kid will be in touch. Then they get the first bill with text messages, and they'll say, oh, God, let's get the $10 all-you-can-eat messaging plan, and then you're off to the races, and what the kid is doing all day is texting back and forth. So there, too, I think parents have to, and maybe this is a case of this being just so new, so we haven't really seen the drawbacks to it, but I think parents have to start challenging their faith in ever more technology, particularly to ever younger kids. So thank you all for your attention. Thank you.